Let's start talking about period 6, which goes from 1865 to 1898, and this particular subtopic will be the rise of industry in this period. And so we have 3 parts of the discussion that we'll be mentioning throughout this video, and then we have our concluding question at the end. What is the rise of industry? In 1900, this new industry, this second industrial revolution, leads to the United States being the top industry or industrialized nation, more so than the European countries and nations that we had come from or once originated. The country was a treasure house of raw materials essential to the industrialization: coal, iron ore, copper, lead, timber, and oil. You have the start of steel industries. You have the oil industries led by Rockefeller, Carnegie, and you have the big banking industries as well as the railroad industry, J.P. Morgan, Jay Gould. You also have a lot of plentiful capital. A lot of Europeans now move up into the middle class. You also have this new this new source of labor known as factory labor, where people can go into factories and work as a part of the industry for middle class wages. But a lot of times, but with Edison's invention of the light bulb, or creation of the incandescent light bulb, people were able to work throughout the night, but they didn't know that it was the night, so a lot of factories would board up their windows and force the laborers to work extra hours for the same pay. And so let's get right into the railroads. And so the railroads have existed for a few decades at this point, and so originally you have these railroads that ran throughout the country. The first Transcontinental Railroad happened around in the mid-1850s, and you also have these small railroad lines that go throughout the North and the South, but not really throughout the Midwest. We haven't really connected the Midwest to the North and the South yet at this point. But during the Civil War in 1862-1863, since the North, they were the ones that controlled Congress, they were the ones that controlled the laws, and they had absolute power, they were able to pass legislation that promoted industrialization. And so henceforth, when the South rejoined the Union after 1877, they were they were basically inducted, we'll say, into this industry because of the fact that they had lost their major source of labor with the abolition of slavery with the 13th Amendment and the protection of their rights with the 14th and 15th Amendment. They no longer have this plentiful source of cheap labor for picking cotton, and so the cotton industry in the South dies. Not completely, though. You still have the cropland system as well as the sharecropping, and so you still have blacks being subjugated by whites, but through a different manner. But we also should mention that they have to rely more on industry now. They can't just rely solely on this agricultural business because of the fact that the Midwest, actually, since recently after the Civil War, they discovered that the Midwest had better soil for crops, that the South no longer was suited or fit for a large agribusiness, and so that became the Midwestern lifestyle. But in the South, you also have this rise in industry, and we'll talk about that more with the New South. So back to railroads, the South originally had a few railroads, not as much as the North, but after this, there's going to be more than by 1900, there's more than 195,000 miles worth of railroad tracks throughout the United States because of this new industrial revolution. And so a lot of these western rail lines were created through these land grants that the government gave to people to expand territory, as well as set up these railroads across these territories, which therefore led to the connection between the Midwest, the North, and the South because of all these new railways, and they relied on communication. Railroads relied on time, precision time, so that you wouldn't miss your car, cars wouldn't crash into each other. And when I say car, I mean railroad cars, not vroom vroom cars, right? I'm talking about these railroad the train cars, basically. But you don't want these train cars to be crashing into each other because of the difference in times. So the American Railroad Systems, or the American Railroad Association, my bad, set up the 4 districts of time zones. And so you have the Eastern, you have Central, you have Mountain, and then you have Pacific. And so this allows for the more precise time for transporting railroads. And so this is called railroad time. And a lot of people had to convert to railroad time so they wouldn't miss their train, they wouldn't miss their ride. Everyone would rely on this new railroad time, and this leads into the creation of the standard time that we have today. The railroad business is actually extremely competitive, but by 1883, or really 1893, where there's a panic of 1893, the railroad business actually plummets, and so all the competition gets sold to J.P. Morgan, who ends up using his skills and finances of banking to revitalize the industry of railroad making. So now we're going to get into the industrial empires of Rockefeller and Carnegie. And so Andrew Carnegie was a Scotsman who was born in 1835 in Scotland, and he emigrated to the United States in search of a better lifestyle and rose from rags to riches through the American dream, and eventually became one of the first billionaires and created the first billionaire company known as Carnegie Steel, which by the time it became a billionaire mega company, it was owned by J.P. Morgan, and it was called the U.S. Steel Corporation. But Andrew Carnegie is a very important character because he is one of the nation's first billionaires. He created one of the first monopolies, which we'll get into more in the final question, but he was also one of the achievers of the American dream, which is a very important aspect and concept within American society, as it tells us that despite your background, despite anything about it, no matter what, you are still entitled to the same dream of achieving the riches and rights that you so desperately search for and seek. And so Rockefeller set up this major monopoly oil company known as Standard Oil. And what's important about Rockefeller is that he is the first billionaire ever in the United States. And he was not like Carnegie from rags to riches. He didn't obtain an American dream. He was already fairly financially stable. His parents were middle class, so he inherited some of their wealth and put it into his business. His kerosene was used to light lamps used for lighting, as well as a source of fuel. But mostly what oil was used for during this time period was for railroads. It was really for it was for lubricating the gears and the machinery on the railroads, because that's what oil is technically used for. You know, those old oil pumps, or oil pipes or pipettes that they have, and then you put them in the gears so that the gears are lubricated and so they can turn together without chipping or fracturing. And so that's what Standard Oil kerosene used to be for. Kerosene was also used as a fuel or a light source at this time, because he basically created this huge industry where now oil doesn't just have to be used for a certain part of the industry. Now it can be used for another part of the industry, which is why he was able to gain so much wealth. And so now you get into laissez-faire, which is a form of capitalism, which was introduced by Adam Smith in 1776, as early as that, possibly. But Adam Smith was, in fact, the founder of capitalism. And so, capitalism, laissez-faire capitalism to be exact, is this interesting idea where you have a bunch of people competing against one another. The government has to remain completely neutral and free. Like, they're not allowed to interrupt or manipulate any part of capitalism. But the consequence of this form of economic mindset is the fact that it leads to social Darwinism. And social Darwinism uses the application of Darwin's theory of evolution as well as natural selection to say that if you can't find a place in the workforce, that's just natural selection, and you aren't deserving of middle class or middle class status or financial stability, which is a very bad sort of way of thinking, and it leads to people just deciding to stay in welfare their entire life, and that leads to generations of people just staying in welfare and not ever leaving, just waiting for the government to give them their check and just live off that. But that's not what you should do. In fact, that's a social Darwinist belief that, oh, we're just not cut out for that kind of stuff. We will never survive in the working world. Well, that's not true. You just need to try and work hard. And that's it. You don't need to rely on welfare, which is also a part of the New Deal introduced in the 1930s, which is a democratic policy. The major problem with laissez-faire economics as a plan is the fact that the government still has a huge role to play in economics. You can't keep the government out of the working world, because they are meant to enforce the rights of the people, and if the rights of the people are being infringed by their employers, then they have the right to approach the government to protect their rights. And so this is seen in the labor union protests, where because remember how the employers were mistreating the employees. See this in the labor union protests because as you remember, the employers were forcing the employees to work more hours, despite being paid the same for more work. And then we also get into the technology and innovations. And so we also have Edison, who created the incandescent light bulb, which was refined by Westinghouse. And so Westinghouse created alternate current, which is what a lot of the schools use nowadays, because it allows for multiple lights in multiple rooms, and so you can just have multiple switches as well. You don't need one switch to turn on and off every single light. The problem with the direct current was the fact that it didn't last very long. It wasn't as strong, and it wasn't as protected or resistant to surges. And a lot of inventions are created during this time. You have Alexander Graham Bell's telephone, and you have a lot of innovations on top of that. And so this is, in fact, a great part of industry, is the new technologies and innovations that occurred during this time period. And so now let's get into the wages, the factory labor, the middle class, and the strike. So we already talked about wages, and we already touched upon factory labor, but let's get into this rising middle class. So in this time period, unlike before, working in a factory was in fact a middle-class paying job, unlike today, where working in a factory is not in fact middle-class pay, and it puts you in poverty. And the rising middle class is a corresponding consequence of these new industries created by Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Morgan, and others like Gould, creating these factories and industries that people can work in to get paid middle-class wages. During this time period, have a lot of working women, because women are desiring their own rights during this time period, and that is a continual part of society is women are always requesting to have the same sort of opportunities and jobs as men. And you can see that today with women trying to fill up the STEM field, even though women before they didn't really want to be in the STEM field, but now all of a sudden, because it's popular, women also want to work in it as well. And you realize that from before, because women didn't really want to get their hands dirty before they realized these men were making billions, millions of dollars, and their husbands were making these middle-class jobs, raising up to middle-class status, and they decided that they wanted that as well, and so they started working outside. But, of course, they were going against these realms of domesticity, or the fields of domesticity, which were put in place that restricted women to the household, which, of course, is wrong, because women weren't really granted the same rights as men at this point in time. As I said before, there's a lot of discontent with the labor and the working wages and the amount of work that they had to do, because they were being forced to work for the same pay despite working more hours, which is actually, as you know, part of communism, which is why capitalism if manipulated by the employers, can be shifted into small sects of communist and socialist principles. And so you have a lot of these strikes, because these labor strikes and labor unions, because of the fact that you have these people being upset with their mistreatment in the working force. Despite their ascension to middle-class status, they're still being denied, relaxed time, but of course you have this Puritan work ethic where they're forced to work more, and if you don't work, then that's unethical. The United States, in fact, only has 2 vacation weeks, and if you're sick, that takes away from your vacation. While in most nations outside of the United States, you have around 6 or 8 vacation weeks, and if you're sick, that doesn't count against you, or if it's closed on holidays, that also doesn't take away from your vacation hours. And so the final question that we have today is, what is the consequence of monopolies? And so the consequence of monopolies, so a consequence isn't necessarily bad. It can be a good thing. It just means, what is the impact of monopolies in today's society? Well, in today's society, you have a ton of monopolies. You can think of one, right? Apple, Google, Microsoft. There are so many monopolies. College Board is a monopoly as well, because they're the only ones that produce this SAT, the ACT, and the AP exams. So they're in fact a monopoly. They make a ton of money off of their one product, that they're the only ones who produce this for the market. The only ones. So College Board is in fact a good example of a monopoly. And so a consequence of this is it floods the market. You have these monopolies that control one product, or they control multiple products, and no one else competes with them. And so they flood the market with all of these products, and they're the only ones people buy, and people don't know whether they're good or bad based off of comparison, because they're the only ones there. We don't know if the SAT is good or bad, because no one has ever produced their own SAT. College Board is the only one that produces the actual SAT. We don't know. And so they flood the market with all these SATs and ACTs and advanced placement exams, because they're the only ones that produce this sort of a product for the market. And so this is the reason why a lot of colleges nowadays are thinking about not requiring the SAT or ACT anymore, so that they can stop College Board from having so much of a monopoly and flooding the market, because now colleges sort of realize that it's not a good judgment of academic ability or knowledge as well. It doesn't test what you know in what you learn or what you know in high school. It's just a test, and if you study hard and learn the ways around it, you can pass. You don't necessarily have to be good academically, and you can get into a good school regardless of your actual abilities. And so that is a huge negative consequence. But what's good about monopolies is the fact that it encourages people. It encourages people to seek this sort of American dream from rags to riches, such as like Andrew Carnegie. And so that is a good consequence of these monopolies.